Thank you everyone for joining us today as we're covering one of our special edition topics, restorative justice storytelling, during this year's webinar series. My name is Avery Arrington. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm an assistant director at the National Center on Restorative Justice. At the National Center, we offer these type of webinars on a consistent basis in an attempt to increase access to restorative justice education within a criminal legal system context, but at the same time, provide opportunities for folks to highlight their work that's being done across the United States and that is contributing to the overall RJ movement. So if you're tuning in for the first time to this webinar, or we're welcoming you back for another time, you're in for a treat today. We have an amazing lineup of guests who will share their work as artists, writers, practitioners, filmmakers, producers, and activists, all who in some way or fashion are advancing restorative justice advocacy and education efforts through storytelling. So before I turn it over to today's moderator, I want to express sincere special thanks to our host institution, Vermont Law and Graduate School, our additional grant partners at the University of San Diego and the University of Vermont, and the Bureau of Justice Assistance, which is a part of the U.S. Office of Justice Programs. If you like what you hear today, feel free to check us out and visit ncorj.org to learn about different topics related to restorative justice that we'll cover each month this year. So I'll now turn things over to our moderator today, Dr. Lindsay Pointer, whom I've had the pleasure of working with at the National Center, and she serves as principal investigator for our grant. Lindsay is also an assistant professor at Vermont Law and Graduate School and the author of the children's book, Wally and Freya, A Restorative Justice Story for Kids. Thank you for hosting today, Lindsay, and thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your story and your time. So I'll turn it over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Avery. So looking forward to today and today's topic and to this wonderful group of speakers and panelists we have. And thank you everyone for tuning in today. Want to just first say that I think that this topic is so important to the restorative justice movement because often we're talking about a paradigm shift. We're talking about really reimagining justice, and the work that storytellers, that artists, that creative people do is perhaps the most powerful work in that reimagining that needs to be done in giving us kind of new ways of thinking about justice in that public imagination. And I had a quick quote from the Narrative Initiative that I wanted to share as kind of a grounding for some of what these panelists will share. So the quote is, "Narrative defines what we imagine is possible and why, what we aspire to become and how, and whether we feel we have power with or power over others or none at all." And so each of these people who will be speaking today is doing so much of this work of helping us to imagine what is possible, helping us to imagine what we can become. So just again, thank you all for being here. In terms of our plan for the time that we have together, these 90 minutes, I'm going to first go one by one to each of our panelists and invite them to share a little bit about their work by means of introduction. I have just one or two questions for each of our panelists to help us to become acquainted with their work. And then we have a few questions that we'll be inviting all of the panelists to speak to and to kind of engage in dialogue with each other around. But we would also really love to hear the questions that you all have for this amazing group. So please feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom. You can find it right on the bottom of your screen to type in your question, and we'll make sure that we leave time at the end of this webinar so that the panelists can answer your questions as well. So we're looking forward to that. To go ahead and get us started, I'm going to come to you first, Charlene. Charlene does a lot of amazing restorative justice work and is also an author. Her book, Play the Game, was published in 2023. And I will say that personally, it was my favorite book that I read in the entire year of 2023. It's an incredible novel, highly recommend it. And without giving away the plot, because you should read it for yourself, I'll say that one of the things I really appreciate about Play the Game, Charlene, is how it really speaks to the need for restorative justice at individual levels, and then also these broader structural levels, and really shows through your story the layers of complexity of needs and impact at those different levels. And I just really admire the way that you were able to do that in your novel. So I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write a book about restorative justice, the process in writing that book, and what you hope readers will take away from your novel.
Ooh, great question. Thank you so much. And thank you for those kind words as well. Writing the novel was so exciting because, I've been a criminal justice activist, what we used to call it before it was criminal injustice and, transformative justice, all of that work for decades. And then in the last, I don't know, 10, 12 years, more specifically on restorative and transformative and healing justice work. So that's just been kind of my life's work. And I've also always been a writer. In one way or another, I never really pursued publication until recently, but it's been a love of mine. And so when I decided to go get an MFA and think about writing and write a novel, this is what was on top, right? This was right there to be talked about and what I wanted to be able to put out in the world in the form of story. And so that's really sort of the inspiration, that this is where my brain sort of lives in so many ways and my heart lives. And what I'll say too about that, I think answers your question is, the sort of why of it and how I hope that the book is helpful in this question of storytelling and restorative justice, is that I hope that it will give people a road into the reality. You use the word reimagine, Lindsay. It takes a lot of imagination at this stage because the dominant narrative is so prominent. It's so deep in us. It's so well done. It's so old. It's so big. It comes through so many sources and avenues that for us to be able to imagine beyond it and think of something different, we need as many sort of stakes in the ground, as many concretes as we can get. And I think that literature and storytelling can do that. I will throw out a book that's done it for me in a different way that I want to recommend to people as well. It's called Acts of Forgiveness. And of course, in this moment, I can't think of the author. I'll think of it, but Acts of Forgiveness. And what it is it's a story that is sort of, regular realistic fiction, but is as if a Reparations Act has been passed. And it's just that story, right? It's a regular novel. It's, it's modern day folks going through their lives. But what you get to see in the course of that novel is what would it be like? What are the, what about the backlash? What about the economics? What about, the kids? How would you prove it? How would you do it? What would it look like? All of those pieces that feel too big to imagine, I didn't have to imagine because this author did it for me. And so now I can see it and I can get my hands on it and I can think differently about it. And honestly, it feels so much more attainable to me. So that is what I hope that storytelling and literature in restorative justice can do for us as well. Make it real, put a stake in the ground, help us get to that space of imagining something so much bigger and better than what we have now.
Thank you so much, Charlene. I love that, that sometimes it takes fiction, it takes stories to help us see what can be real, that kind of bridge into realness. So thank you so much. We'll have the opportunity to hear much more from Charlene, but I'll just continue in kind of our introduction circle so that we can hear each person's voice before we dive in. But thank you, Charlene, for starting us off. David, I'm going to come to you next. That's okay. So David, I remember personally first encountering Amplify RJ, which you are the creator of, maybe about 6 or 7 years ago. And I thought, wow, I haven't seen anything like this before. This sort of content being put out into the world about restorative justice, these kind of shorter form videos and reels and little bits of audio that then, connect to larger form podcasts. And I just thought it was such a powerful way to get the word about restorative justice and this different paradigm out, and have just continued to really love following your work in all the years since. And particularly appreciate how central that anti-racist and decolonial lens is to all of the restorative justice content that you create. So just offering that appreciation and hoping that you can tell us a little bit about your strategy behind Amplify Restorative Justice, Amplify RJ. Tell us a little bit about the content you create, the stories you share, and the work that you're doing on that platform. So over to you.
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, that 6 to 7 year memory serves to highlight how long the last 4 years have been, because that's how long Amplify RJ has existed as a platform. But when I initially started Amplify RJ simply as an Instagram account, it was because I also realized that there was nobody out there doing something like that. And because So many people are glued to this device for so much of our day, whether it is on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, what have you. I thought it would be beneficial to put content about restorative justice out there to literally amplify restorative justice. There wasn't much strategy from the beginning. It was share what I know, share my thoughts, and then from there, getting connected with lots of people, specifically in education spaces, who were doing restorative justice work, was really helpful to target content towards the needs of some of the people who are engaging. But also, I've had this continual drive to talk about restorative justice, not just in the context of criminal legal systems, not just in the context of the school to prison pipeline or what we do with discipline in school, but how restorative justice integrates into everyday life. And so on the podcast, this Restorative Justice Life on all platforms, go like, rate, subscribe, review, all of the things. We have deep conversations with people who have been doing restorative justice work for a while in whatever context, but really thinking about how it applies to their day-to-day interactions with people. Because as much as restorative justice or a restorative process is about, what happened, who was impacted and how, what needs must be addressed in order to make things right or as right as possible, who's responsible for meeting those needs, so much of the way that we relate to each other on the day-to-day basis is not about repairing harm. It's about how are we actually proactively building and strengthening relationships rooted in equity and trust. In so many ways, that is remembering the teachings from Indigenous people across the world. When we think about values of Ubuntu, I am because we are, or in Lakech, I am another you, Alaken, you are another me, Mitakuyasen, like we're all relatives. Like all of these Indigenous cultures, and some of us more farther removed from them than others, have these ideas of interconnection at their core. And so putting messages out there into people's consciousness and, to the Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, podcast algorithms is my way of insurgently trying to make a difference and further amplify this work.
Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate that and appreciate you correcting my timeline. You're correct that I was thinking, oh, I know it was before my 4-year-old daughter was born, but a lot has happened in these last years. But yes, thank you for the work you do. We'll hear more again from David soon. But continuing in our circle of introductions, I'm going to come next to Carol and then Jamil. This might be the first time that we've had family members on a panel together, which is particularly exciting. And I'll say that, I first learned a bit about both of your stories through the film The Bond that we'll hear more about from Jamil in a moment when Avery sent it to me. And it's just such an incredible film, so deeply moving. But Carol, I'd love to come to you first, if that's okay, and just ask you to tell us a little bit about your story and how it's related to your activism for criminal justice reform. And how has telling your story been an important part of your activism work? Sorry, Carol, it looks like you might be muted.
Yes, I'm
There we
muted.
go. Okay.
Because my cat was playing with his tail. Thank you. Sorry.
Perfect.
Thanks. So I'm so glad that you asked us to come on. Myself, not only myself, but my daughter, and her work, speaks to the harm that the criminal justice system portrayed in our family. In a nutshell, my story is one of being abused as a child sexually, and eventually leaving my home in the South, coming to New York to reinvent myself and leave that stigma and harm behind, but not realizing it at the same time that in moving, I was still bringing that trouble with me because it was inside of me. And eventually succumbing to drug use in order to relieve the pain. And while I was addicted to drugs, I got pregnant and gave birth to Jamil while I was incarcerated at the Rose M. Singer Center in Rikers Island. But even at the hospital, I was shackled. From the jail, all during labor and while giving birth. And a couple of days later, when I was returned to Rikers Island, they made me leave my baby in the hospital, and it just broke me. It broke our relationship. all the hopes and dream I had for overcoming my addiction and getting a new place and coming home and me and my family being one and beating that. I mean, it was such a horrific ordeal that the depression that I felt before using came back full um, full force. Not only that, but also the stigma of having had my child ripped away from me like as if I was nothing. And someone saying to me, a corrections officer saying to me, well, first of all, a corrections officer watching my child being born, being being given an epidural, which numbed me from the waist down, and I couldn't move, and yet I was still shackled, like as if I was an animal. And having another officer say to me, when I was crying for my child to bring her back to the Rikers Island nursery to Rose M. Singer, if I really wanted my child, I wouldn't be in jail. And I internalized that, and that's what really broke me. I agreed. What mother has a baby when she's incarcerated? If I really wanted to have a baby, I should have stopped using drugs and gotten myself together way before I got pregnant. And that's what I believed. And when I was able to bring Jamil back, they called me and said, okay, your paperwork is all good now, and we want to let you go, let your brother bring her here, and now, you can be in the nursery with her. The depression was so deep that I just said, no, she's fine where she is. And that idyllic relationship and reunification that I had pictured was just gone. And it affected Jamil because eventually my brothers took Jamil for a vacation to South to meet the family while I was still in addiction. And my grandmother, who had dementia, thought Jamil was me. I don't know why, but she had raised me. That was a joke because Jamil and I look so much alike. My grandmother thought in her dementia, she thought that she was seeing Carol again. So she kept calling Jamil Carol. And my brother thought it was a good idea to leave Jamil in the South to be with grandma, and because I wasn't able to get myself together, I thought it was a good idea at the time too. But not realizing that the time with not having, like out of sight, out of mind, I was able to use freely, and it was years before Jamil and I reunified. But when I did get clean, I went to treatment. I was incarcerated again, and I had to ask for treatment because I was facing time for drug possession and attempted sale. And I was allowed to go to an alternative to incarceration program after writing a letter to the judge and DA on my case about, what had happened to me as a child, why I believed I used drugs. I didn't have an alternative to the depression and the pain. And they listened, and they allowed me to go to treatment. After which was when Jamil and I reunified. But at the same time, I went to college after treatment and started to write about my experiences with the Adoptions and Safe Families Act, which was the law in New York that allowed parents to be separated from their children permanently if they were in court-mandated treatment or incarcerated or anything else after the child had been in the system for 50 to 22 months. And I came home to having to fight for my children. Also, I found out about a movement, which was called the anti-shackling movement, where they were fighting to make sure women no longer were shackled. And I became hooked. I was amazed that people were actually fighting because I was not the only one this happened to, which is, in the midst of addiction, you think you're the only one. And I was, instrumental in helping in New York to get that law, to get both of those laws, right, to get the anti-shackling bill passed, and also to get changes made to the Adoption Safe Families Act, where a judge was now able to look at the strides a parent or parents were making in order to make that decision about whether to terminate rights or return these children to their families. Because one thing people don't talk about is when you terminate the parental rights, you also terminate sibling rights. And so I became, after I was able to help, get these pieces of legislation passed in New York, I got hooked and I started traveling with a group called Women on the Rise, telling their story. We traveled all over the United States, helping other at colleges and centers, Morehouse and critical resistance and others, um, conferences and colleges and seminars and everything, helping people to get the legislation and the language right so that they could also present present it to the representatives in their areas to help get a similar law passed. And up to now, it's about maybe only 11 states left, and wherein there is absolutely no type of legislation for anti-shackling, and a lot of the legislation on Adoption Safe Families Act has changed as well. I'm grateful that for Jamil's film, because a lot of the times when as she was growing up after our reunification, she would ask me about the story of her birth.
Okay, I can take it from here then.
Okay, very good.
Okay, great, great.
And I pass
Hi.
it to you, Jamil.
Yes, great. Hi, I'm Jamil. I'm a writer-director, and I made the film The Bond, which is a semi-autobiographical film that follows an incarcerated pregnant woman as she gives birth. The film started off as a tool for healing, for my mom and me, but I very quickly realized throughout the process of making the film that I didn't want to just create an autobiographical film that essentially recreated the trauma and the harm of the experiences of the people who were birthing people and their kids who were shackled, and their kids who were taken while they were shackled. I wanted to tell a story that I felt would implement the entire system, and to tell a story that wasn't just an individual story, but a story that focused on building solidarity and like ending, I think, the stigma that often happens when people experience this in private. One of the things my mom said, recently or just now was that, she thought she was the only person that this happened to. But as I was developing the story and the script, I did a lot of research. I researched and interviewed my mom, her experience, but I also researched and interviewed doctors who serve the population. And I read like legislation, and I saw that, this anti-shackling movement was happening, of course, but that, we needed a tool really to not just put a face to, and to like create empathy and humanize, as they say, this population, but like a tool that would be a short tool that we could use for, as we're, trying to build legislation and change policy that we can take with us. And so I made this very short film that's 16 minutes long that follows this mother as she's fighting to maintain her dignity and her relationship with her baby. However, it was very important to me that I created a nuanced story that wasn't just demonizing the officers involved, but that really highlighted that it's a systemic issue. And so that's sort of where it began. And since then, been very lucky to take this film around the world. I've had some really amazing experiences where I've gone with my mom to speak on panels as we are today. And even speaking at the Free Her conference, which is this incredible conference that is focused on ending the mass incarceration of women and girls. But yeah, being able to also take this film to just like film festivals and just kind of, film is not just this tool for building empathy, but it's also, this incredible tool for informing people. And so you'd be surprised. I mean, the last film festival I went to was in Alaska, and you'd be surprised how few people know that this is happening and that they can get involved with restorative justice movements and build solidarity within their own communities. So yeah, I'm just really honored to be here and really grateful to be here. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much, Jamil, and thank you, Carol. We're looking forward to hearing more from both of you. And yeah, just thank you for all the ways that you are leaning into that power of storytelling. Staying with the film theme, we're coming next to Jamie. Jamie, you and I first met when I got the chance to interview you and some of the team members that you did the Red Summer Project series with. And it was such a fun interview process for me to just hear about both how promoting restorative justice and justice reform is, so a part of the films that you create at Local Legend Films, but then also internally how you work together as a team and using restorative practice. And then we've gotten to work together since then for projects under National Center on Restorative Justice. And it's been just a pleasure to continue learning how you do that work on so many different levels. And so I'm hoping that you can tell us a little bit about the art of storytelling in your filmmaking work. You're a documentary filmmaker, and also the role that restorative justice is playing for local legend films more broadly as well.
Thanks. Yeah, so my name is Jamie Joyce. I run a documentary film studio called Local Legend Films, as Lindsay mentioned. And aside from the Red Summer Project, which is a kind of like a passion project and an original film series that we partnered with some local RJ facilitators to produce, our work is mostly kind of commissioned by local nonprofits and clients, basically. So we do a lot of commissioned work. And in that in that endeavor, it's a lot of the topics are on justice reform. And so we have a commitment to employ people who are justice involved in the storytelling process behind the scenes. But restorative justice is kind of like we try to weave it into everything we do. And so just, I mean, having the opportunity to hear like the story of this beautiful film that we just all experienced right now is just like this amazing testament to the possibility of how restorative justice can be a part of documentary filmmaking. And so one thing that we think about internally are that there are like there's all kinds of relationship building and relationships that are happening like in front of and behind the camera and within communities. And so that's kind of like a central theme for us. We try to navigate and build relationships within I'd say there are 3 communities in every story, and then there's usually like a 4th, and those are like the first is the community of like the people who are in front of the camera, let's say, and then there's the community of the people who are behind the camera, and then there's the community of the audience, and then in addition, there's oftentimes the community of like the funder. In our case, it can be the client, it might be the studio. On the news, it's the network. And so there are all these kind of like communities that exist and have a relationship to this story, which is an emotional experience that we all share, and and impacts us all in different ways. So yeah, that's like a little bit of it. I mean, I would like to mention that, we as a team, we oftentimes practice restorative justice. Like, for about a year, we actually held circle and just sat in circle for 2 hours a week together. But one thing that has come up within the documentary film community is this concept of vicarious trauma, and like how are we behind the camera and in front of the camera, how are we taking care of each other and supporting one another emotionally? Is there a space for that? And then in addition, for audiences who are either being informed of something that they didn't know about, and how are they able to kind of process what it is that they're also experiencing? How are we able to hold space for that? And I think that for us as like trained restorative justice peace circle keepers, facilitators, etc., like this is like a wonderful opportunity for us to kind of really, I don't know, just like just create a lot of change through this art form.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And we're excited to hear more from you as well. So closing out our circle of kind of initial introductions, we'll come to you, Jay Stephen. And so Jay Stephen, you're an actor, a playwright, and then I know that you're also a facilitator who uses circle practice quite a bit in your theater work. So we'd love to hear just more about how you do that, how you're using circles in the theater context, and why that's been important to the work that you do.
Yeah, thank you. It's Jay Steven. Folks also call me Slim. I use he, him pronouns. I came to RJ actually as an activist, as an abolitionist, formerly system impacted and in recovery. I thought I might be leaving my work in the arts for another career, maybe in harm reduction, but I have spent most of my life working in theater um, because of the power of storytelling to create empathy and deepen connections to one another, and the way storytelling, and particularly live performing arts storytelling, promotes discourse and growth in a really immediate, kind of visceral way. And of course, this is also true of RJ. Both of these things are rooted in the sharing of stories to open minds and bring people together, both within and among different communities. So the traditions are already aligned. For me, it was clear that I wanted to bring these two things together. I was seeing in the last few years a lot of harm and a lot of exploitation in professional arts organizations. Um, it's ironic that those of us who are professional storytellers are often not very good at telling our own stories, that we are tasked with telling other people's stories, but we don't necessarily have the opportunity, the space, the language to actually advocate for our own needs, especially when harm happens. And there aren't things in place to prevent harm from happening in the first place, particularly with regard to things like race, gender, and labor exploitation. The hierarchy and gatekeeping in professional arts organizations is often counterproductive to collaborative creative work, is what I'm finding. So I wanted to bring restorative practices to arts organizations, mainly professional theater. And I do that mainly through circle practice. I do facilitate repair processes after harm has happened. Sometimes that's between individuals, but more often it is actually about institutional accountability. Um, and then I also teach workshops on how to create community circles that empower people to bring themselves, their whole selves, to a storytelling process. So a lot like what Jamie was talking about behind the scenes. I'm an actor and playwright, but my RJ work is very much in bringing restorative practices and restorative culture to the organizations that are employing storytellers, to sort of get beyond this idea that we should just, like they say, shut up and sing, right? But to actually bring our own lived experiences to the stories that we're telling. The challenge in that is that often administrators don't want to allow the time and space for that, that they don't want to take time out from the work. What I find is that organizations that employ restorative practices in a regular, consistent way actually do more and better work, that they actually become more productive, because storytelling is the work. But the other thing is it undermines hierarchies. It challenges the way that we make art professionally in these institutions, and that is about envisioning a new way of doing things. For me, what it comes down to is I don't think we can tell stories about restorative justice if we are not embodying it, if we're not actually living restorative justice in our working relationships. And that's when we get to bigger visions and telling stories about what's possible in the wider world.
Thank you so much, Jay Stephen. And thank you all for that introduction to who you are and the work that you do. It's all just very, very inspiring to hear about. So as I mentioned, I now have a few questions to pose to all of our panelists. And so if you have something that you want to contribute on a question, feel free to just unmute yourself and to enter into dialogue with each other. And then just a reminder to our audience today to be using the Q&A function to ask any questions that you have for this wonderful group of people so that we can make sure to get to your questions as well. So for the first question for discussion, I think this is something that Charlene mentioned when you were sharing, Charlene, that there is this really dominant narrative that gets kind of established again and again, that justice equals punishment, right? That kind of dominant paradigm around what justice means, what we mean when we say the words justice. And I think each of you have talked a little bit about the power that storytelling has in disrupting that. But I'm hoping we can dive into that. What are we trying to change about that dominative narrative, and what is the particular role that storytelling plays in challenging that dominant narrative? So anyone who wants to start us off in discussing that first question, please feel free.
I can start us off. I could talk about that forever. First of all, what an amazing panel. Thank you all so much. I feel like I already just learned so much in the introduction round, which is amazing. Justice equals punishment is what we have with our mother's milk in our country. It is if we are told that something has harmed us, we are told that justice looks like mostly incarceration. Maybe it's a big old fine, but in some way, right, it is punishing the person that harmed us. And it goes even further than that. It's not even just that justice equals punishment, it's that closure equals punishment, right? Like if you're gonna get over it, if you're gonna get past it, if you're gonna be able to move on in life, which is implying that healing equals punishment. Like it's just huge. It's almost all of our media tells us a story. A lot of books. My book has a mystery aspect, and as I was writing it and sort of learning how to promote it and think about other books in that context, I thought about murder mysteries, and it hadn't really occurred to me. It's like, these are fun books. I like murder mysteries, and every freaking one of them just about ends with, and then you get the bad guy, and the bad guy goes to jail, and you're there, right? Like you spent a whole 300 pages hanging out with the protagonist and like waiting for that, and you just like don't even think about it that much. And so I looked, and I found other authors like myself who had written murder mysteries where that didn't happen. And it's like, and it took some digging, right? And you had to find it. And so it's just another example of how huge this story is and how it just sort of sneaks up on you, right? It's just not always about, it's your entertainment, it's Law and Order, it's CSI, it's your murder mysteries, it's, all of it. Justice equals punishment. And not only is it dangerous because it's just not true, right? But if you believe, and therefore promotes mass incarceration, which is dehumanizing and all of the things that it is, but it also is not true if you want to heal. Like it doesn't actually heal you to watch someone get punished. It may feel satisfying, like everybody has that instinct, right? Like who hasn't wanted to lash out at someone who hurt them? It's not that that's, a bad instinct, but it doesn't get us to healing. So when in my healing work, which I have done a great deal of as well over the years, what people want, what I know I want as well in healing is to tell my story, to know I'm not alone, to ask questions, to get answers, to look at something that looks like repair, to get help, right? With the things that I actually need, the things that were taken from me to be in some way restored, that actually helps, all of those things. But it's very seldom the fact that I got to smack you around and see you up under the jail is the thing that really brought me healing. Maybe a moment of satisfaction, but not healing. And so for all of those reasons, we want to get past this justice equals punishment thing. I will say one other thing about storytelling and why it's important in that, and that is that, and we've all said it in a million ways, like we think in story, we learn in story, we pay better attention in story, right? Who doesn't want to hear a story over a set of statistics, like all of those things. We heard some very real stories today. I know that I was leaning in toward the screen as Carol spoke and told her story, because it is a story as opposed to just information or what have you. But I also want to say, not only is there a lifetime of media and entertainment that is already just set up to tell the story of how justice equals punishment, that I honestly don't think that most of the storytellers are trying to be like, I'm going to support mass incarceration today. Like, right, I am anti-restorative justice. Like, that's not, I don't think that's the thing. I think it's just really deep in them. But I have recently realized, as our movement moves forward, that there now are stories that are coming directly at restorative practices. I watched an episode of a series called Elspeth the other day that literally was, you've seen it? Have you seen it, Carol? I see you nodding. That was coming for people like us that were like, oh, harm was caused, and therefore we should move into action. It's not about jail. They were coming for us. And so we are not the only ones that know the power of story in this work. And I just say that to say it's really important that we speak our truths, that we tell our stories, that we encourage other people to do so, because that it is the fact that they are true, and that will make them resonate in a way that other stories will not, even against this huge weight that we are up against.
I'd like to add a little to that too. I love how the Restorative Justice Initiative organization, they one of their main ways of framing it is more healing, less punishment. And it's just incredible that over the years how this system that was supposed to be about corrections, which I say is like about rehabilitation, has now become about punishment, payment, um, an eye for an eye. If you do something that hurts me and my loved ones, you should spend the rest of your life in jail. Sometimes, one you see in some of the shows, like, not just that one, which I love, Elizabeth, but also Law and Order and criminal, and also Law and Order not criminal, but Special Victims Unit. You see that sometimes they do try to work out an alternative method of repayment, reparations, restoration. And sometimes family, because they're so used to this, if someone hurts me, they have to go to jail. They get upset about the amount of time a person gets. Like, is that all the time they got? And I remember having to fight. I was in Rikers Island for 5 months, going back and forth to court for 5 months before I wrote that letter. Because every time I went to court, the judge said, "Is she ready to take this time?" And I was facing 4.5 to 9 for drug possession and attempt to sell. And they were telling me, "Oh, but you don't have to do the 4.5 to 9. You can do 3.5 to 7." And I was like, "No, I have children. I can't do 3.5 to 7 years in jail because I bought or sold $10 worth of crack. Are you kidding me?" It was, it was just, to me, it was just like, I couldn't believe that they were telling me this. And I was like, yeah, here they come for Carol again. I couldn't believe this was the norm. 7 years of prison for $10 worth of crack to another addict, And it's just, I was just amazed that, eventually I just, by telling my story, is what got me the ability to go to an alternative to incarceration program. And that was not the norm. And I just didn't understand. So many about, well, I had read an article that spoke about the children that were in the foster care system, and that the mothers were mostly women who had either been sexually abused as children, in domestic violence situations, or trafficked, or the boyfriends were selling drugs out of their apartment because their name were on the lease. The women were going to jail, and that the women were, instead of getting treatment, the children were they were sitting in jail while the children were in the foster care system, and some of their children were also being abused. And the fact that when the mother was removed from the household, it was that much more of a chance that the children, not the father, daddy gone, the family coalesces. But when mom goes to jail, the family, falls apart, and then the children were more likely to go to jail as well. And I just don't understand why they would be willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep one person in jail, rather than spend 1/10 of that to send them to treatment, reform their life, and come back and become a participating member of society. And it's just incredible to me. It was incredible. So that's why I kept writing these kinds of articles while I was in college. After finding out that, I was able to, put my story into so many of the essays that I was doing, taking in sociology or drug and addiction or anthropology was just amazing that this was not the norm. Why was the United States spending so much money to keep people incarcerated instead of, you know, spending less money and putting that money somewhere else? Like we hear decarcerate the police. How about decarcerate the jails? How about decarcerate the courts?
I think a lot of what this is highlighting is when we tell stories, we are able to better highlight people's needs. And that's what justice is, getting people's needs met, right? Within the context of, the criminal legal system, we're able to see that so much of what's happening is because of poverty, addiction, and like systemic issues that, individuals have experienced. And, sometimes I have a hard time thinking about restorative justice within the criminal legal system because who is the justice for? Like, even if somebody goes through an alternatives to incarceration program, how is the system being held accountable for the actions that they've caused? And yes, there's legislation and reform, but like there is not actually reparations made from the system to individuals and individual families who have been harmed in this way, right? When you think about time that people have been away from their families, money doesn't fix that. But money is a way to make sure that people have the resources that they need to be able to spend the time to heal their families, right? And so if we're talking about what justice means, getting people's needs met, we can talk about that within the context of the criminal legal system. We can talk about that in the context of a classroom, right? There are varying degrees at which, we can highlight needs. But I was just having this conversation with a fourth grade teacher who was having the hardest time getting one of her students to stay on task and he wasn't finishing his works. And so she would hold him back for recess. And I was asking her, what need do you think holding him back for recess is reaching? And as she was thinking about it, she couldn't give me an answer. And I was like, okay, well, why isn't he doing his work? Well, it's because he doesn't care about school because he's going to be a football player. Great. Okay, so this is this kid's motivation, right? Who is the community member, the high school football coach, the college football player from this kid's community who can talk to him about, I believe in your ability to be the next, football player, famous football player. And in order to get to where I got, right, I needed to at least pass my classes, but also learn the focus and discipline to learn a playbook, to run routes the right way, to know how to shoot the gap, to learn where to follow blockers, right? How are we meeting that kid's need for connecting school to his goals? And that doesn't happen within the context of okay, sit here for 5 minutes during recess to finish your work, or sit here during recess, where you're just going to build more resentment between me and the teacher, right? We're talking about that on the micro level, and we can see so many ways that plays out in the criminal legal system, but really making sure that we're able to really think deeply about what's going on in people's lives, so we can highlight the needs, is where we get to restorative solutions. And storytelling in the ways that all of our panelists have shared is just a really great way to do that.
Yeah, can I jump in on that? I I feel like so much of what we do in the abolitionist movement is talk about dismantling dominant institutions and building alternatives, right? And I feel like the way we talk about RJ as storytellers or as artists, we also need to sort of mirror that in a way. That it's not just about sort of uh, reforming the existing storytelling platforms that we have, but to create new ones. And everyone on this panel is doing that. We're pushing at what it means to write a book or make a film. Using social media as storytelling is a move forward, because so often the containers we have for telling stories, RJ doesn't fit in them. Primetime procedurals, 40-minute dramas, they don't lend themselves to process. RJ is process. And very often, most of the time, it doesn't wrap up as neatly as we want it to in a police procedural or in a murder mystery. So I think that one of the things that those of us who tell stories as and about RJ are tasked to do is to actually expand storytelling forms and to find new ways of sharing our work.
I can also chime in on this and possibly segue a little bit in that I've been thinking about this idea of, justice equals punishment and, basically what you were just saying, Jay, around the fact that a lot of narratives in Hollywood in particular, oftentimes on the news, um, basically they revolve around the drama triangle, which is the victim, rescuer, persecutor roles, and so it's a bit of a, I mean, literally the genre is drama, like I don't know exact, I mean, I know that that goes back to like the Greeks or something like that, but there's something just inherent in, I think, that the way that whether it's like Hollywood and entertainment or whether the news is picked up on like, you know, this like cliche term that I've heard, like if it bleeds, it leads, things like that, that we are all consuming this content. And and so I think that, yeah, there's a huge responsibility for us as storytellers, particularly us as storytellers who are familiar with RJ, to hold space and to inform or bring awareness about alternative approaches, about the fact that restorative justice even exists, to some of my storytelling colleagues who just, whenever I say the word restorative justice, their eyes glaze over. And so I think that there's this responsibility there to just kind of like continue doing this work and to continue to amplify RJ and bring it out there so that those who are telling these stories, can try to make shifts. Because I do think that there's a huge, I mean, as consumers of content, people are watching non-traditional platforms such as YouTube. Even just the concept that series on streamers and things like that are being there is more of an appetite, I guess, for long form content. And right now, all that's available is, true crime or some of these things, So I think that there is a real opportunity there for like a new world of narrative to be introduced. And so unfortunately, I think that it is going to be us who are kind of like leading the way, or just holding the space, I guess. Like maybe leading again is that hierarchical model, but just kind of holding space and introducing and prompting other storytellers to think differently about the way that they're telling stories, and honestly the harms that they are causing in the way that they're telling stories.
Thank you so much for that, Jamie, because what that reminds me of is the importance of thinking about social impact filmmaking. As oftentimes when people think about social impact filmmaking, they think about documentary, but I'm a narrative filmmaker. And one thing that I've been working to do, not just with the bond, but with my next projects, is building relationships with community organizations from the ground up, even as I'm in pre-production, even as I'm developing scripts, to figure out what does the organizations on the ground offer, and how my films or my stories can actually further these goals. It's people who are already doing the work, right? We're a part of a larger ecosystem. And I think about our work in that way, where it's like, we're not just going to build stories to build empathy and to educate people and to inform. That's great and all, but how can our projects and our stories be used to further the work that people who have been already doing the work, further their goals, right? And actually also reach the communities that we want to reach, right? Create representation for communities that won't often see themselves reflected on the screen, and create representation of restorative justice and normalize it, so that it's not this thing where people glaze over when they hear social impact filmmaker, or they like glaze over when they hear restorative justice, right? But that we create representations that are so broad and so numerous that it's normalized the same way that a show like CSI and propaganda and police procedurals are, right? But yeah, I think that starts with like when we start putting pen to paper, we think, okay, what are the organizations that I can actually partner with from the ground up? And then how do I reach the communities that I want to reach, right? Like, who is my audience? How do I think about indie filmmaking often as being this thing that's just like not particularly accessible. that's the other problem too, is that our documentaries and our narrative films and our books sometimes are not the most accessible. So then how do we reach the communities that we want to reach? It's by building coalitions from the ground up, real coalitions. And that means partnering with, again, organizations that are already doing the work, that have been doing the work for years and years and years.
Thank you all so much for speaking to that question. And it's just really striking to me how, when we are breaking with that kind of dominant narrative, there's actually so much more opportunity for interesting stories and more creative possibility when we're leaning into actual individualized needs of people and the stories and complex lived experiences. So thank you for that. Another thing that came up in some of our conversations preparing for today's webinar is the importance of human-centered language. So in the same way that stories have this really deep power in influencing how we think about the world, similarly, the language we use, the terms we use, they influence us and the way that we see the world, the way that we see people. And so moving away from some of those stigmatizing terms that we hear towards more human-centered language choices. So would love to just ask for anyone who wants to speak to this question, why is it important to think about human-centered language in storytelling, and how does that show up in your work?
I'll jump in because I kind of brought up the drama triangle a little bit. And yeah, I mean, I guess like referencing the fact that like in our system, there is a victim, there is a perpetrator. I like labeling people with those labels, as storytellers, as people in our everyday lives, when we're speaking in that kind of language, it's sort of like perpetuating those states of being. It's kind of like recreating that cycle so that person is only a victim of that particular incident. And we see it all the time in the news. We see it in these murder mysteries. We see it. I mean, it's kind of like, it's just so pervasive, that one thing that has occurred to me is just getting into the practice, and because it's often just it's a total like switch in mindset in the way that everything is done, I guess, but I do believe that more individuals that the more individuals that are able to kind of like educate others and not necessarily call them out on it, but just kind of like build this awareness so that there is just sort of like a general practice amongst us as storytellers. I think that is kind of a real key critical shift for us all to make in doing this work. But again, it's such a big lift because it's baked into the way that the system is right now. So even if the news is underlining that in the way that they're telling stories, and our parents and our neighbors and everybody is seeing that, it's really difficult to constantly be kind of like almost the grammar police or something, like, oh, it's just yeah. So I do think that we can kind of like lead that shift in terms of just helping, things can't be different if we don't see it differently. And so in all of our work, I think that we can kind of just model that. So
Yeah, I watched this happen in real time in theater production and on television production as well, where the language of the story being told uh, is picked up by the community telling it. And that's really potentially dangerous when you're telling stories about the criminal legal system, right? People start to relate to each other off stage and off camera the way their characters do, and it starts to perpetuate harms. So you have to actually institute some practices to use different language in order to create a different culture that is contrasted uh, with whatever story you're telling. And as we've been saying, we're so often telling stories about justice equaling punishment. It's There's a danger to replicating that within a creative community if you're not actively using person first language for example?
And here's a small example of that is like when I was casting, when I was working with a casting director to cast for the background actors in the prison, the casting director, because I didn't do the work of saying, hey, this is the language I want you to use for the background actors. What came out was, okay, inmate 1, inmate 2, inmate 3, right? And it's like, absolutely not. These background actors are actually playing incarcerated individuals, right? And this is something that we talk about in general when we're talking about restorative justice and just human first language, is that people are not, as Jamie said, just victims or just or criminals. They are people first, right? Incarcerated individuals, and people who are looking for healing, as well, on both ends of the spectrum.
They're cons and prisoners.
That is a thing in casting. And those of us who are actors, like for me, I make choices around those things, like what projects I'm willing to take on. What stories do I want to uplift? And the first thing that I see is how characters are described in a casting breakdown. And that tells me whether I want to be part of this process or not. So that's an example of how in the collaborative storytelling arts, it's at every level, every stage, that we have to bring in the right kind of language for the kinds of stories we want to tell.
Yeah, and it bothers me that I see that language being used by educated journalists all the time, even though we're always talking about being politically correct and making sure we don't use oppressive language. And it's also, something that it's the bane of my existence, that whenever they describe a person who is allegedly caused harm in the paper, more often than not, people who are not of color, on their whole criminal background doesn't come into play. Whereas if you're a person of color, that's one of the first things. Even if you're dead, even if you're innocent, they still say how how you died, and then they bring in your criminal report, your criminal justice report, and I try to figure out what does that mean, and also. If you're not a person of color and you're up to like 20 years old, I'll even give you 19, you're still a child or a teenager. Whereas if you're Black, I heard them describing the young woman that died last week. She was 15 years old, and they said she was a woman. She was 15. It was either the 15-year-old or 17-year-old, and they said the woman. And I was like, why is this person a woman and she's only 15 or 17 years old, Forgot what paper I saw it in, but I'm wondering, when is that going to change? When are we going to get politically correct about that? Why did they still find the need to adultify people of color, even before, even when they're like 13, 14, they're thugs, and that.
I think what you're getting at is the idea of like us needing more, again, to expand representation and models of, alternative models. Once again, it's like, I've been thinking a lot about, specifically with like anti-shackling. It's like, whenever we're at various panels, one thing that we often talk about are organizations and systems, alternative systems that are doing the work that we can then point to and say, hey, this is an awesome example of them doing the work. So for example, like it makes me think of like the Minnesota Doula Project, talking specifically about anti-shackling here now, or Our Children, right? These are organizations that provide education, housing, addiction resources, even training formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated individuals how to do the doula work so that they can create spaces of healing around reproductive justice. Because when I think about justice, I think about reproductive justice and the treatment of mothers and children or birthing people and babies immediately. And the ways that like we create spaces for them to have not just dignity, but to have safe and to have agency over their lives, right? And so these are organizations that are doing the work of healing and of ending mass incarceration and ending recidivism by creating spaces that are alternate, options, right? And I think like we can point to that in different areas. I'm focusing on reproductive justice. My mom's focusing on reproductive justice, but we are all kind of doing it in our own ways. Like David with creating spaces in social media, So yeah, I hear what you're saying, Mom, and yeah, that's more examples of that.
Yeah, I kind of want to just chime in with one last thought that around language, and I know that we're kind of talking about like human-centered language, but at least within the documentary field, and I think that so I do a lot of work around gun violence prevention, and something has occurred to me that I guess I just want to kind of tease out a little bit here, is that there's an interesting word choice in the fact that we've chosen to say that we have a video shoot. And there's this interesting thing that has occurred for me every time like, for instance, I've had to reframe the idea that I have, like, I'll say I'm videotaping at a school versus there is going to be a shoot at the school and things like that. But there's just such an inherent language choice in the term of almost creating, I don't know, just like the power imbalance that's there when you point a camera at someone. And like, so therefore the person behind the camera just has a huge, I don't know, I guess, again, this is something that I'm still teasing out and I'm not quite sure what it is I'm trying to say about it. But even amongst my colleagues, like within the documentary field, there's this concept of doing a run and gun shoot or something like that, where you're just going out into the field with the camera without a plan. So rather than saying that, it's just the terminology that's used, which is just very strange to me, and something that I think that we could kind of think about in terms of like, is that something you would say if you're really looking to be collaborative and build relationship with people, I guess.
Yeah, just a quick tag on to that. I think what you're talking about is evolving a language in your field, right? That we have to think about all of the words that we use and how do we evolve a language. It's something that James Baldwin talked a lot about, evolving a language to control your circumstances, to name them, to keep yourself from going under from the powers that be, right? That may be working against you. And I think that's a great example about using a camera and the power dynamics there. And I also think that just more specifically in our field of transformative, restorative healing justice, our field of ending mass incarceration, like the more we evolve our language, the better. Like the fact that we are so up against all of this justice equals punishment makes it difficult actually to have language. Like we're not different than anybody else that grew up on this, right? Like we might think about it more hours of the day, but words don't just come into your mouth. Like I bet we've all had, that Thanksgiving dinner moment where we're like, I can't respond to that. Like, I don't have the words right now. Or you're at a, party or whatever, and someone says something that you really don't agree with, and you're like, can't do it. But the more we evolve our language with each other, the more that language is readily available to us. And the more we can, like you use the term, Carol, adultifying children. Like that's a really useful term. And it's right there. And, the next time you see somebody that's a, 12-year-old being called a man or a 15-year-old being called a woman, that's adultifying Black children. Please don't do that. Like, but if you don't have that language, and it's just like, Lord, how am I going to explain this? Right. So the more we evolve our language, it began with Eddie Ellis and the New Greenhaven think tank and that letter, right, where we started talking about formerly incarcerated people instead of inmates and, and cons or what have you, and this plea to our movement to humanize folks, and it just keeps on. I would love to offer examples if it comes up in another question, but I know we've been on this question a long time, but I just think for
Yeah.
us in our field, it's important to evolve our language.
Yeah, Eddie Ellis called it the language letter.
Yep, the language letter.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. So it's such great thoughts and such, great dialogue about this importance of language and how the words that we use are such an important piece of everything, all this work that we're trying to do. We have a couple questions from our audience that I'm hoping we can come to. So the first question here, this audience member has mentioned a theological concept of scapegoating or a single victim mechanism and the subsequent cycle of violence. So that myth of redemptive violence and the alternative countermyth of love and forgiveness as kind of those storytelling archetypes, another example of those. So this feels to me similar to, Jamie, you brought up the kind of drama triangle that we see. And so the audience member is asking about whether any of you have familiarity with those particular concepts in storytelling, but I'm going to open up that question a little bit more. I'd love to hear if you have familiarity with those specific concepts, but also just more broadly, if there are kind of specific storytelling concepts or models that each of you think about in your work of, trying to lean, like the drama triangle that you mentioned, Jamie, of, I'm seeing this cycle show up again and again in the stories that I encounter, and I'm trying to do something different or do this different kind of counter myth work. And so anything that brings up for any of you of kind of those archetypes that we see showing up in stories, whether it's the specific concepts that this audience member is asking about or others.
Well, that language of scapegoating, that phrase that has also morphed, because that was the term for one of the children in the home of children in the home of adults, adult children of alcoholics, the scapegoater, one of the children who usually took the rough parts of the family's their anger, their stress, they would put it on this one person, and then it'd be the child. They would say that one's the act out or whatever. So then they would scapegoat and put all the divert all the anger from the alcoholic to this child. But today, by the question I think they're asking is about the division in the community, which are reduced to one division, the division of all against one common minority or one minority group, whatever. And that group is now the scapegoat for all that's wrong in society. And this is not just something new. This is something that was invented, if you know your restorative justice, way back when Blackness became synonymous with criminality, because they needed a reason to be able to treat us the way they were treating us, and making us enslaved people, that they had to take care of us because we were animals in Africa, and they had to bring us here for our own good. They had to teach us a new religion. They had to teach us about God. They had to give us the Bible, because we were around there waiting for someone to come and save us. And when we tell them how we want to be saved today, we just want freedom. We just want alternative ways of rehabilitation. The system that you built around poorness that makes it a crime, and you continue to just give out little bits and pieces. Food stamps, for instance. I was a social worker for many years. Food stamps for a family of 2 is $204 a month. For one person, it's about $170 something. And we know and with all this and the news talking over and over about inflation and this and that and the feds and interest rates and all of this, they have so much money for war, yet they don't have money to feed a family of 4. Even if if you had co-workers that were working that couldn't make ends meet. And it's just like, this war on drugs, this war on poorness, the systemic breakdown of society that's basically for us, but has now become a part of even people who are not colored, of white people, what they call the poor whites, who, because they can't pull themselves up by their bootstraps, then they should, suffer the same lot. That scapegoating of us as, we don't want to do better, and that's why we the way we are. I don't know any educated person who believes that, and that they've got to stop scapegoating us for the systemic and constructive injustices in our communities.
I think those frameworks are in media all the time, right? The myth of redemptive violence, scapegoating, all those things. And, one of the things that I've been able to do with the podcast is call those things out. I'm not sure how many people who are listening or of my fellow panelists are familiar with the HBO show or the previously video game called The Last of Us, right? But within the construct of that show, there is a lot about us versus them, and revenge for, they do to us, we do to them. And, we see the logical conclusion of that at the end. And, as somebody on social media using other people's stories to highlight, oh, you see this? It didn't have to be this way, can also be a way to, interrupt those narratives and call them out when they're present.
Yeah, and I also want to mention that, so the drama triangle is a psychological construct, and oftentimes like it's a transactional cycle that is, the part of the reason why it's a triangle is like it's almost like the Bermuda Triangle. You can get stuck into it. And I do believe that Hollywood gets stuck into it, but the psychological principle of it is that um, in order to step out of it or find healing is for each person to take responsibility. And I just don't see that happening always, or just the space for that to happen in Hollywood. And so because it's kind of like gossip, it's kind of like she did what, they did this, etc. And so it kind of keeps us hooked into this, continuing to click to the next episode or etc. So anyway, that's just something that I kind of want to bring up, is that I do think that there's opportunity there. And then obviously, like, conflict is necessary. I think part of, what I think is interesting about whether it's entertainment or storytelling is that I'm very excited that, like, due to the pandemic, we're more as a society excited to talk about mental health collectively. And it's less of a taboo subject, I guess, as it was in speaking about our emotions. But I think that up until now, and possibly for a while yet, storytelling and watching films, maybe, etc., is almost like a collective form of therapy for us to process and sort of like co-voyage with what is happening with the main character and to work these things out. But do they ever work these things out? It's like they just keep getting into trouble. And so I don't know, that's just, again, something that has been on my mind as a storyteller that I haven't fully teased out. I don't know that that's a claim I'd love to stand behind, but it's something that's kind of been true for me sometimes.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in with our final question so that we have time to hear once more briefly from each of our panelists. I wanted to
Can I
also
just say one thing about just an alternate?
Of course, yeah, of course.
So just a quick resource for people who might be interested in alternative storytelling structures. One of the main storytelling structures, mythic sort of archetypes, is the hero's journey archetype, which is often about this individual who uses violence and has to, like, basically eschew the world and go off and do this thing all on their own, right? There's something called and anybody can be a heroine and anybody can be a hero in this archetype. It's not a gendered thing. But an alternate archetype that I really love and that I've been really getting into recently is Gail Carriger's idea of the heroine's journey. Again, it's not a gender thing, but it's the way that people within the stories pursue their goals. So in the hero's journey, usually it's an individual focus, right? But in a heroine's journey, it's about this person that realizes that they need people to help them reach their goals. And so they go around in the heroine's journey archetype, they go around, they look look for people who have specific skill sets that are useful for achieving a goal that's good for the benefit of all. One of the, a small example of this would be like something like a heist story, right? Wherein this person collects individuals who are all skilled and ultimately they all work together to achieve this goal. And so you can see, and oftentimes with these kinds of stories too, it ends sort of a cozy feeling or like a happy feeling versus like a hero's archetype where the person is usually alone at the end, right? They've lost loved ones and all of that. So if you're more interested in different types of mythic structures, look into heroines' journeys.
There was actually a movie called The Heist. I think it was might have been, I don't remember who it was, Daniel Craig, but there's a story called The Heist where they collected people with a certain amount of skills, like Liam Neeson says, have a particular set of skills. Okay, come on, Lindsay.
Great, perfect. Thank you so much for that addition and for all of these suggestions. I have this list going of things I want to follow up on and look more at after this conversation. So to kind of close us out, I know there's so much more that we could say in this conversation. I first want to share a quote from a question that we received that I think resonates with a lot of what has been shared today. So someone put in the Q&A that the medicine we need for healing is in the stories we share. And I think so much of what each of you has shared has spoken to that and resonated with that quote. So for a final question, and we'll just come to each of you briefly in like 1 minute or less so that we stay on time, just what closing advice do you have for listeners today about how they can engage the power of storytelling in advancing restorative justice in the context of their lives? And if it's okay, maybe I'll come to you first, David, and then we could just each pass to another next person.
Yeah. Simply tell your story, right? Whether it's in the context of conversations with family, colleagues, or if you are courageous enough to decide to post on your social media platform of choice, getting these ideas out there in public consciousness for just general awareness and further discourse is how we make this work grow and, further amplify the work. Whoever's next.
Yeah, it's about telling your story. I found in that question before, the healing does come from, I found the healing in telling my story instead of the stigma of hiding it. I found the power in telling my story. I found the power in helping others learn how to tell their story. So that's why 18 years later, I'm still telling my story because it works.
I'm going to pick it up from there.
Sorry, I'm going to pop it over to Jamie.
Okay. I was just going to say that I'm really inspired by you, Carol, and one advice I'm giving myself and others is if we identify ourselves as storytellers, to try to push ourselves into that uncomfortable zone of telling our own stories. Just kind of picking it up from what you were saying, David. That's something that I have yet to really do. I do consider myself more a storyteller of other people, and that's something that I am thinking a lot about. Just having the bravery to tell your own story and put yourself out there and feel and experience the things that you would feel when you're in that vulnerable place. And a final note of, I guess, whether it's like advice or tips for anybody interested in documentary, that there are two resources. One is a documentary film called Subject, which is being released in, I'm not exactly sure how it's being released, but it's about this relationship between like a filmmaker and the subject, the person whose film it is about. And so if you're interested in exploring more, like, I just like that conversation is being held in the form of that film. And then also there's a group called Documentality, which is an organization that's been doing research about the state of mental health in the documentary film community. And they just released a report that kind of delves into a lot of the things that we've talked about today. So those are just some resources as the form of advice.
I would say that my advice is to find collaborators. I guess that's my theme for today in general, is like find collaborators, collect people around you who can help to bring these stories to life. As a filmmaker, I don't do anything alone. So yeah, I am wholeheartedly all about building communities and alternate like resources from the ground up.
Yeah, it's all such good advice. Ditto to everything. I guess I would add, if we're telling our stories, and I think it is brave, and I think storytellers, myself included, need to get better at it. We all need to get better at it. I would just add, think about the language that you're choosing, as we've talked about. Think about those structures. I learned so much today. I'd never thought about the drama triangle, right? Like, think about the structures we choose. We can make process sexy. It's one of the things that really challenged me in writing my book, right? Like, it just feels like, where's the guy with the gavel? That's what makes drama, right? And you have to really think about how to tell a story that feels like it's restorative in a sexy and interesting way. So just to push ourselves a little bit around language and structure and how we think about all of this. A resource I'll add to our list is James Baldwin's essay, If Black English Isn't a Language, Then Tell Me What Is. And he talks about why we need to evolve our own language for all of it, which fits for, whichever us you want, right? In our field as storytellers, in our field as RJ practitioners, and just the importance of word choice and thinking about our language and then fighting for it.
And I'll just quickly add, when you're consuming, enjoying, hearing stories in media, in art, look for restorative storytelling. Look for the heroine's journey. Look for alternatives to incarceration. So often we actually bury those narratives under something else. But once you see it, once you see, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse as a restorative story, you begin to see it in lots of different places. And I would say, seek it out, uplift it, share it.
Wonderful. I think that's everyone. Thank you all so much for just an incredibly inspiring conversation. Really, really enjoyed it and learned so much. I'll pass it back to you, Avery, to close.
Oh, Joel, we're in for a treat. I knew it would be a treat for everyone. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Before we close out, I just want to uplift all the amazing contributions and the work these folks have created and put out in the world. Panelists, if you're okay with it, and a follow-up email to our attendees once I share the recording, is it all right if I link some of your projects and work so they can check some of those things out when they get a free moment? Thank you for the thumbs up. Next month, we're picking back up with a regional lens focus on RJ implementation. RJ in the North is up next. That'll take place on Wednesday, June 26th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you again to all of our panelists. Lindsay, thank you so much for doing us a solid and moderating this wonderful panel today. Thank you all again for attending, and we will see you next time.